Let me paint you a picture of academic torture. Picture the most boring lecture hall you've ever been in. Now multiply that by the fact that it's floating in space, filled with aliens who think they're intellectually superior to every other species in the galaxy. And the professor sounds like he's gargling gravel while explaining why your entire planet is basically a petting zoo. Welcome to Advanced Xenobiology 401 at Kepler Station University, where dreams go to die and humans go to question their life choices. Professor Klorvac stood at the front of the amphitheater, all 7 feet of him draped in what I can only describe as academic robes that had been designed by someone who clearly hated both comfort and fashion. His species, the Vraxians, looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, given it a PhD, and then cursed it with the personality of every condescending professor you've ever wanted to stuff in a locker. Today, primitive minds, Klorvac announced, his mandibles clicking with barely concealed disdain. We shall discuss the galaxy's most fearsome predators, creatures so terrifying that even the mention of their names once sent entire civilizations fleeing to the furthest corners of space. In the back row, Jake Martinez slouched in his seat, trying to look interested while simultaneously wondering why he'd thought an interstellar exchange program would be a good idea. At 22, Jake was what you might charitably call aggressively average. Brown hair, brown eyes, and the kind of face that made people say things like, "You look familiar," without ever being able to place where they'd seen him before. Next to him, completely oblivious to the academic suffering surrounding him, sat Buster. Now Buster was what humans would instantly recognize as a golden retriever. What the alien student body saw was Jake's emotional support companion, which was the only way the university's bureaucracy could process the concept of bringing a dog to space college. Buster had the intellectual capacity of, well, a golden retriever, which meant he was primarily concerned with 3 things: food, belly rubs, and whatever interesting smells might be hiding in the corners of an alien space station. Currently, he was trying to determine if the Zephyrian student in front of them might be edible. The Zephyrian, a gelatinous creature that looked like someone had taught a jellyfish how to take notes, seemed blissfully unaware of being evaluated as a potential snack. The creatures we shall examine today, Klorvac continued, warming to his favorite subject, represent the pinnacle of evolutionary development, unlike the pathetically harmless fauna of certain primitive worlds. And here he paused to give Jake what could only be described as a look. You know the kind. The look that says, "We're not naming names, but we all know which disappointingly peaceful planet we're talking about." These predators were the stuff of nightmares. They were evolution's masterpieces of death and destruction, before various cosmic catastrophes rendered them extinct. Klorvac's compound eyes glittered with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people discussing their favorite serial killers. Jake sank a little lower in his seat. 3 months into his exchange program, and he was getting pretty tired of the casual earth-bashing. Sure, humans didn't have acid for blood or the ability to phase through dimensions, but they'd managed to figure out space travel, and hadn't blown themselves up yet, which had to count for something. Buster, meanwhile, had given up his gastronomic assessment of their gelatinous classmate and was now intensely focused on something under Jake's chair. Probably an alien equivalent of a dropped chip, which in Buster's world made it the most important archaeological discovery since the tomb of King Tut. "I trust," Klorvac said, his voice dripping with the kind of academic superiority that made you want to give him a wedgie, "that even our most limited students will find today's material educational." The other students, a mix of species that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of nightmare enthusiasts, chittered and buzzed their agreement. A few of them glanced back at Jake with what he was learning to recognize as alien pity. Great. Even in space, he was still the guy everyone felt sorry for. Jake scratched Buster behind the ears, receiving a tail wag that somehow managed to radiate pure contentment despite being surrounded by creatures that could probably dissolve him with their saliva. At least one of them was enjoying the cultural exchange experience. Professor Klorvac activated the holographic display with a flourish that suggested he'd been practicing that move in the mirror for weeks. The air above his desk shimmered, and suddenly the lecture hall was filled with the 3-dimensional image of something that looked like it had been designed by H.P. Lovecraft during a particularly bad fever dream. "Behold," Klorvac announced with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies, "the Zolothian apex render." The hologram rotated slowly, giving everyone a good look at what appeared to be a cross between a saber-toothed tiger, a porcupine, and someone's worst nightmare about dentistry. It had more teeth than seemed mathematically possible, each one the size of a baseball bat, and apparently made of some kind of crystalline material that gleamed with an oily, rainbow sheen. The Zolothians, Clorvac continued clearly in his element, were a species of pure predation. Their homeworld was basically a horror movie that had achieved planetary status. These particular specimens could grow to the size of your human vehicles, and their razor fangs could slice through starship hulls like tissue paper. A collective shudder ran through the alien students. Even the blob-like Zephyrin managed to quiver in what Jake assumed was fear. Jake had to admit, the thing looked pretty intimidating, like something you'd definitely cross the street to avoid, assuming you had streets and weren't just floating in the vacuum of space screaming. Buster glanced up at the hologram, gave it the kind of look he usually reserved for squirrels, and went back to investigating whatever fascinating scent signature was coming from the ventilation system. Of course, Clorvac added with casual cruelty, even humans would have the good sense to run from such a creature. The hologram dissolved, replaced by something that looked like it had been conceived during a particularly unpleasant acid trip. This new creature was roughly the size of a city bus, covered in what appeared to be organic armor plating, and had a mouth that opened in directions that seemed to violate several basic principles of geometry. The Morthak Battle Beast, Clorvac announced, bred by the Morthak Empire as the ultimate biological weapon. These delightful creatures could spit acid that would dissolve steel in seconds, and their hide was thick enough to deflect plasma cannons. The Morthak Empire used them to terrorize entire sectors of the galaxy before the Great Plague wiped out both Predator and Creator. More impressed chittering from the audience. Jake noticed that several of his classmates were taking notes with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Apparently, extinct nightmare fuel was a popular subject in xenobiology circles. Naturally, Clorvac continued, because apparently he couldn't help himself, such a creature would have made short work of any Earth fauna. Your largest predators would have been appetizers for a juvenile battle beast. Jake felt his eye starting to twitch. It was becoming increasingly clear that Professor Clorvac had some kind of personal vendetta against his entire planet. Maybe a human had cut him off in traffic once, if traffic existed in space, which it probably didn't. But the principle remained. The third hologram was, somehow, even worse than the first two. It looked like someone had taken a spider, scaled it up to the size of a small building, given it way too many eyes, and then decided it needed tentacles, for reasons that probably made sense to someone somewhere. "His Vorthan Mind Ripper," Clorvac said, and his voice actually dropped to a whisper, like he was afraid the thing might hear him despite being extinct for roughly 10,000 years. These were perhaps the most terrifying predators ever to evolve. Not only were they physically imposing, but they possessed psychic abilities that allowed them to literally tear thoughts from their victims' minds before consuming them. They could paralyze entire armies with fear alone. Now that got everyone's attention. Even Buster looked up from his thorough examination of the floor, though that was probably because someone 3 rows down had just unwrapped what looked like the alien equivalent of a candy bar. The Vorthans, Clorvac continued, clearly enjoying the rapt attention, were so advanced that they actually used these creatures as hunting companions. Imagine, if you will, a species so evolutionarily superior that they could domesticate the galaxy's most feared psychic predator. Jake was starting to get the distinct impression that this lecture was less about extinct predators and more about making him feel bad about being human, which, honestly, was pretty much par for the course in his academic experience. "I suppose," Clorvac added, with what Jake was learning to recognize as Vraxian smugness, "that humans would find such creatures challenging to comprehend. Your species' definition of a dangerous predator is, after all, somewhat limited." And that was when Jake's patience officially ran out. But Clorvac wasn't done. Oh no, Professor Clorvac was just getting warmed up, like a particularly obnoxious engine that needed several attempts before it would start running smoothly. He gestured dramatically, and the holographic display shifted once more. What appeared above his desk this time wasn't just scary. It was the kind of scary that made you question whether the universe had any interest whatsoever in your continued existence. The thing was massive, and when I say massive, I mean it made the other creatures look like house cats. It was roughly the size of a city block, covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating that looked like it had been forged by some cosmic blacksmith with serious anger management issues. It had multiple heads, each one equipped with enough teeth to supply a small dental school, and appendages that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent intelligence. "And now," Clorvac announced, his voice taking on the tone of a man revealing his prized baseball card collection, "we come to the crown jewel of extinct predators, the Kraxon Alpha." The lecture hall fell silent. And I mean really silent. The kind of silence you get when everyone suddenly realizes they're looking at something that could have eaten their entire homeworld for breakfast and still had room for lunch. The Kraxin Alpha, Clorvac continued, clearly savoring every word like fine wine, was not merely a predator. It was a force of nature, a living apocalypse. These magnificent creatures were capable of consuming entire ecosystems. They were living ships, capable of interstellar travel, hunting across star systems for suitable prey. He paused for effect, scanning the room to make sure everyone was appropriately terrified. A single Kraxin Alpha, he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an ominous whisper, once depopulated an entire sector of space. 17 inhabited worlds. Gone. Consumed. The Alpha didn't just kill its prey, you understand. It absorbed them. Their knowledge, their genetic material, their very essence became part of the creature. The alien students were practically vibrating with a mixture of fascination and existential dread. Even Buster had stopped his investigation of the floor and was now staring at the hologram with what looked like mild interest, though that was probably because the thing was moving and golden retrievers have a genetically programmed fascination with anything that moves. Nothing, Clorvac declared with the kind of finality usually reserved for pronouncing death sentences. Nothing in the known universe could have defeated a Kraxin Alpha in its prime. It was evolution's perfect killing machine, the ultimate apex predator. Even our most advanced civilizations would have fallen before such a creature. He gestured grandly at the hologram, which had begun to move, showing the creature's various terrifying features in loving detail. I trust, he said, his compound eyes sweeping the room with academic superiority, that even our most primitive exchange students can appreciate the sheer evolutionary magnificence of such a creature. This is what a real predator looks like. And that was it. That was the moment Jake's brain finally said, you know what? Forget it, and decided to take matters into its own hands. Jake's hands shot up. The lecture hall fell even more silent, if that was possible. It was the kind of silence that suggested the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what was about to happen. Yes, Clorvac said, his voice dripping with the kind of sensation usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. Jake looked at the hologram. Then he looked at Buster, who was now wagging his tail because he'd apparently decided that all this attention meant treats were probably forthcoming. Then Jake looked back at Professor Clorvac and delivered the 5 words that would forever change the galactic understanding of Earth's food chain. My dog ate one. The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was the kind of cosmic pause that happens when the universe suddenly needs to recalibrate its understanding of how things work. You could have heard a pin drop if pins existed in space, which they probably didn't, but the principle remained intact. Every alien head in the lecture hall swiveled to stare at Jake, then at Buster, then back at Jake, then back at Buster, who was still wagging his tail. Because, as far as he was concerned, this was turning out to be a much more interesting day than he'd initially expected. Professor Clorvac's mandibles began clicking in what Jake was learning to recognize as the Vraxian equivalent of a computer trying to process information that didn't compute. I'm sorry, Clorvac said slowly, like he was speaking to someone who had just claimed that gravity worked sideways on Tuesdays. Did you just say, your dog ate a Kraxin Alpha? Jake nodded cheerfully. Yep, about 3 weeks ago. Found it on our morning walk. The clicking sound from Clorvac's mandibles increased in both speed and volume. It was like listening to someone rapidly shuffling through the world's most confused deck of cards. That's impossible, Clorvac said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Kraxin Alphas have been extinct for over 50,000 years. Jake shrugged. Yeah, well, apparently somebody forgot to tell the one that crashed on the outskirts of New Denver last month. The lecture hall erupted, and when I say erupted, I mean it achieved a level of chaos usually reserved for natural disasters and really bad karaoke nights. Aliens were chittering, buzzing, clicking, and making sounds that Jake was pretty sure weren't supposed to come from biological organisms. Order, order, Clorvac shouted, though he was starting to look like someone who had just discovered that his life's work might need some significant revisions. Explain yourself, human. Jake leaned back in his chair, scratching Buster behind the ears. Buster, for his part, had decided that all this excitement definitely meant treats were imminent, and was now giving Jake the full golden retriever treatment, head tilted, tail wagging, eyes wide with the kind of optimism that suggested he believed the universe was fundamentally a good place that existed primarily to provide him with belly rubs and snacks. "Well," Jake began, like he was discussing the weather rather than completely destroying the foundational principles of galactic xenobiology, "it was Tuesday morning, and I was taking Buster for his regular walk around the crater field outside the city." He paused to pull out his phone, which caused a ripple of confusion among the alien students. Apparently, primitive Earth communication devices weren't standard equipment in advanced xenobiology courses. "Now, you have to understand," Jake continued, scrolling through his phone with the casual air of someone who wasn't currently causing multiple species to question their understanding of the universe. "Buster here has what you might call an adventurous palate." Buster woofed softly, as if confirming this assessment of his dietary preferences. They're walking along and Buster starts getting really excited about something near this big metallic wreckage that the cleanup crews hadn't gotten to yet. You know how it is with dogs, they smell something interesting and suddenly it's the most important thing in the universe. Jake held up his phone, showing a video of what appeared to be a golden retriever enthusiastically digging around what looked like the remains of some kind of spacecraft. The wreckage was definitely alien in origin, all smooth curves and materials that seemed to shift color in the light. Now I figured he'd found some kind of space garbage, maybe some alien equivalent of a tennis ball. But then he starts pulling out this thing. Jake swiped to the next video. In it, Buster could be seen dragging something that looked like a large, crystalline egg out from under a piece of twisted metal. The egg was about the size of a football and seemed to pulse with an internal light. The lecture hall went dead silent again. "That's a Kraken stasis pod," whispered someone from the front row. Jake thought it might have been the Zephyrian, though it was hard to tell since they didn't have vocal cords in any traditional sense. "Yeah, that's what the research team said when they showed up 3 hours later," Jake agreed cheerfully. "Apparently it was some kind of egg or larval stage or something. Been in hibernation for about 50,000 years, just waiting for the right conditions to wake up and start terrorizing the galaxy again." He swiped to another video. This one showed Buster carrying the egg around in his mouth like a stick, tail wagging with pure joy. "But here's the thing about golden retrievers," Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was causing several alien species to have collective nervous breakdowns. "They're really enthusiastic about their toys, and once they decide something is their toy, well..." The next video showed Buster in what appeared to be Jake's apartment, happily chewing on the crystalline egg like it was a particularly large rawhide bone. "There's a 50,000-year-old apex predator," Chlorvac screamed, his academic composure finally cracking completely. "Was," Jake corrected helpfully. Past tense. "Buster's got pretty good teeth." The final video showed Buster's food bowl, now containing what appeared to be crystalline fragments mixed with regular dog food. Buster could be seen in the background, tail wagging, looking extremely pleased with himself. "The research team was pretty upset," Jake admitted. "But honestly, what was I supposed to do? Take a chew toy away from a golden retriever? Have you ever tried to take something away from a golden retriever when they're really enjoying it? It's like trying to negotiate with a furry four-legged force of nature." He scrolled through a few more photos. "Oh, and this is from last week. Buster found some kind of crystalline scale things near another crash site. The xenoarchaeology team says they're from something called a Zilothian apex render." The photo showed Buster's toy basket, which now contained what appeared to be several rainbow-colored crystalline fragments that gleamed with an oily sheen. "He likes to carry them around," Jake explained, though he did try to bury one in the neighbor's garden. Mrs. Peterson wasn't thrilled about that. Chlorvac was making a sound that Jake was pretty sure wasn't supposed to come from any known biological organism. It was somewhere between a strangled cry of anguish and the sound a computer makes when it's trying to divide by zero. "But that's not the best part," Jake continued, clearly warming to his subject. "Show them the video from yesterday, Buster." As if on cue, Buster reached under Jake's chair and somehow produced what appeared to be a metallic fragment covered in organic-looking ridges and spikes. It was clearly not of Earth origin, and it had bite marks on it. "Found this yesterday morning," Jake said proudly. "The research team thinks it might be part of a Morthok battle beast carapace. Buster's been using it as a chew toy." That was when Mike Chen raised his hand from 3 rows over. Now, Mike Chen was the kind of guy who made Jake look exciting by comparison. He was studying interstellar accounting, which was exactly as thrilling as it sounded, and he had the personality of someone who collected tax forms for fun. He was also, unfortunately for the collective sanity of the alien student body, another human exchange student. Excuse me," Mike said in the tone of someone apologizing for existing. Is this the thing Jake's talking about? Mike held up his phone, showing a picture of what appeared to be an orange tabby cat sitting in a cardboard box. The cat looked smug in the way that only cats can manage, like it had just solved world hunger but wasn't going to tell anyone about it out of pure spite. That's Mr. Whiskers, Mike explained unnecessarily. He's my emotional support cat. The alien students turned to stare at Mike with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and reality television. Last week, Mr. Whiskers got into the xenoarchaeology lab when I was doing my work study thing, Mike continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was about to add another nail to the coffin of galactic predator theory. He found this weird purple crystal thing that the researchers said was some kind of psychic focus from a Vorthan mind ripper. Mike swiped to the next photo. It showed Mr. Whiskers using what appeared to be a glowing purple crystal as a scratching post. The research team was really upset, Mike admitted. Apparently it was the only intact Vorthan psychic amplifier ever recovered, but you know how cats are with scratching posts. Mr. Whiskers had already claimed it. The sound coming from Professor Klorvac had evolved beyond clicking. It was now something that suggested his entire understanding of reality was being systematically dismantled by house pets. The weird thing is, Mike continued, ever since then, Mr. Whiskers has been acting really strange, like he keeps staring at people and then they start feeling compelled to give him treats. The researchers think he might have absorbed some of the psychic residue. As if summoned by the mention of his exploits, Mr. Whiskers appeared on Mike's video call screen. The cat looked directly at the alien students and somehow managed to convey the impression that he was evaluating them for their treat-dispensing potential. 3 aliens immediately began reaching for what appeared to be their species' equivalent of snacks. Oh, come on, Mike said, apparently familiar with this routine. You can't keep doing that to people. Mr. Whiskers gave him a look that clearly said, "Watch me," and then disappeared from view. That was when Lisa Rodriguez decided to join the conversation. Lisa was the kind of person who somehow made everyone around her feel like they weren't quite living up to their potential. She was studying xenolinguistics, spoke 17 languages fluently, and had the sort of organizational skills that made military logistics officers weep with envy. She was also, at this particular moment, about to deliver the final blow to whatever remained of galactic predator theory. "Are we sharing pet stories?" she asked brightly, pulling out her own phone. "Because I should probably mention what happened with Hamtaro last week." She held up a picture of what appeared to be the most adorable hamster in the known universe. It was small, fluffy, and had the kind of eyes that suggested it believed the world was fundamentally a good place, full of sunflower seeds and interesting tubes to explore. "Hamtaro got loose in my dorm room," Lisa explained, like she was discussing the weather rather than contributing to the complete breakdown of established xenobiological principles. "You know how hamsters are. They get into everything." She swiped to the next photo, which showed what appeared to be a tiny nest made entirely out of iridescent razor-sharp scales. "He built himself a new nest out of some samples I was supposed to be cataloging for my xenolinguistics project," Lacey continued cheerfully. "The research team says they're Zilothian apex render scales. Apparently, they're supposed to be harder than diamond and sharp enough to cut through starship hulls." The photo showed Hamtaro sleeping peacefully in his nest of galaxy, terrorizing death scales, looking like the most content rodent in the history of the universe. "The really weird part," Lisa added, "is that he's been making these little squeaking sounds that the translation software keeps trying to interpret as ancient Zilothian battle cries, though it's probably just him asking for more sunflower seeds." The alien students were now staring at the humans with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that your friendly neighbor is actually an eldritch horror in disguise. Professor Klorvac had stopped making sounds entirely. He was just standing there, staring at his life's work in holographic form, while his entire academic career crumbled around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Wait," said Jake, suddenly looking thoughtful. "Lisa, did you say ancient Zilothian battle cries?" "Yeah, why?" Jake pulled out his phone again. "Because Buster's been making some weird sounds too, ever since he ate that egg thing, usually when he's dreaming." He played a short audio clip. It was definitely Buster, but instead of normal dog sounds, he was making a series of low, harmonic growls that seemed to resonate on multiple frequencies simultaneously. The translation software in the lecture hall's computer system immediately lit up with warnings and began displaying text in what appeared to be several dead languages. "Oh," said the Zephyrin student in a very small voice. "Those are Kraxon Alpha territorial marking songs." The lecture hall fell silent once again, but this time, it wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a room full of beings suddenly realizing that their entire understanding of the galactic food chain might need some fundamental revisions. Jake looked around at the stunned faces of his alien classmates, then at Professor Clorvac, who appeared to be having what could charitably be described as an academic breakdown, and finally at Buster, who had somehow managed to fall asleep during all the excitement, and was now snoring softly while occasionally making sounds that were apparently ancient Kraxon Alpha lullabies. "So," Jake said helpfully, "I'm thinking maybe you might want to update your textbooks?" Professor Clorvac made a sound that suggested his vocal apparatus was trying to process information that fundamentally violated the laws of nature. It was like listening to someone's worldview experiencing a critical system failure in real time. "This is impossible," he finally managed, though his voice had lost all its earlier professorial authority and now sounded like someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the universe was wrong. "Earth fauna are supposed to be harmless, docile, evolutionarily inferior." "Yeah, well," Jake said, scratching Buster behind the ears, which caused the sleeping dog to make a sound that the translation system immediately flagged as a Kraxon Alpha expression of contentment. "Maybe we just have different definitions of harmless." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "I mean, Mr. Whiskers did successfully mind control 3 different species today. That's gotta count for something." "And Hamtaro has been learning to speak ancient battle languages in his sleep," Lisa added cheerfully, "though mostly he uses them to demand better snacks." The alien students began chattering among themselves in what Jake was learning to recognize as the universal sound of people having their fundamental assumptions about reality challenged. It was like listening to a tech support call center, but for existential crises. "But they're so small," protested someone from the middle of the room. Jake thought it might have been a crystalline, though it was hard to tell since they looked like someone had taught a rock formation how to attend university. "And fluffy." Buster chose that exact moment to wake up, stretch, and then somehow produce what appeared to be another alien artifact from somewhere under Jake's chair. This one was definitely organic in origin, covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when you looked at them directly. "Oh, that's new," Jake said, examining the artifact with the casual interest of someone discussing a mildly interesting rock. "Where'd you find this one, boy?" Buster wagged his tail and made a sound that caused the translation system to display several warning messages in languages that Jake was pretty sure weren't supposed to exist anymore. Professor Clorvac stared at the artifact, then at Buster, then at his carefully prepared lecture materials, and finally at what remained of his academic career. "Vorthon," he said in a voice that suggested his soul was leaving his body, "appears to be a piece of Vorthon neural tissue. From their sensory organs, those have been extinct for over 30,000 years. "Huh," Jake said, like someone had just pointed out an interesting cloud formation. "Well, Buster does like his morning walks." And that was when Professor Clorvac did something that Jake was pretty sure violated several university policies. He walked over to his holographic display, stared at it for a long moment, and then began methodically updating his presentation. The title changed from "The Galaxy's Most Fearsome Extinct Predators" to "The Galaxy's Second Most Fearsome Extinct Predators." "Class dismissed," Clorvac announced in the tone of someone who needed to go home and rethink his entire career. "I have some research to do." As the alien students filed out, still chattering in what Jake was pretty sure were several different versions of "what the hell just happened," Jake packed up his things and prepared to leave. "Come on, Buster," he said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Time for your afternoon walk." Buster jumped up, tail wagging, with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that walks were the greatest invention in the history of the universe. As they headed for the door, he somehow managed to drop what appeared to be yet another alien artifact, this one glowing softly with an internal light that hurt to look at directly. Jake picked it up and examined it curiously. "You know, boy, at this rate we're going to single-handedly revolutionize xenoarchaeology." Buster woofed in response, a sound that the translation system immediately identified as an ancient Kraxon Alpha expression meaning, "Can we get treats now?" As they walked out of the lecture hall, Jake couldn't help but notice that several alien students were now looking at him with what appeared to be a mixture of terror and respect. A few of them even moved to get out of Buster's way, like they were afraid he might decide they looked tasty. Which, honestly, was probably a reasonable precaution. After all, if your dog had accidentally eaten the galaxy's most feared apex predator, you probably couldn't rule out the possibility that he might develop a taste for alien cuisine. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, Jake had a dog to walk and a universe to confuse, one casual stroll through a crash site at a time. After all, It wasn't his fault that the galaxy's most terrifying extinct predators apparently made excellent chew toys.